Welcome OS9 Live's forum members, as well as anybody that wants to learn about Pro Tools 5 on a vintage Macintosh. We're going to be talking about Pro Tools on OS9. What you need and how to get going with the TDM Pro Tools Mix Plus system. TDM standing for Time Division Multiplexing. That was the big daddy system that was available in the late 90s and the early 2000s. But before we talk about Pro Tools system, let's talk about what's available today. Let's talk about a modern PC music rig to get some perspective. Today, you can buy a modern PC that has a multi-core processor that is a true powerhouse, and buy a budget interface from anywhere between $100 US to maybe $1,000 US. But there's plenty of good options in the $150 range. So one would be like this Mackie Onyx 2.2 Producer 2.2 would be a good example of a budget interface. Interfaces like that have everything that you would need built into it, really. The interface has headphone output, speaker output, a microphone input, a keyboard/guitar input. So you have mic pre, a direct input, and then those feed the built-in digital audio converter, the DAC, and is also tied in with MIDI. So on this one you can see it right here. We've got these multi-jacks that do 1/4 inch as well as XLR mic inputs. And then you have had your headphone output, volumes for each in the real world, as well as speaker outputs and your MIDI inputs. That single box allows you to interface your whole world in a very basic way, 2 channels at a time. And then your PC is going to handle the digital audio workstation software, that you're going to have mixers built in digitally. That's going to make a playground or sandbox for your VST instruments and your VST effects to live in, and any kind of MIDI sequencer and any DSP processing and power that you want to do is all going to be built into your PC, audio being fed from your interface. Then everything is handled via the multi-core processors today on your modern PC. And then that interfaces the rest of the world because it is directly connected to the internet, and you have things like YouTube and SoundCloud that allows you to publish on the internet. So in this world, everything is very encompassed in one little box. Even when you step up to the larger, like Focusrite style boxes, it's just a larger version of this, more channels, but the output section and the MIDI are pretty much the same. 1 in, 1 out, left, right, that's it. And then your PC carries the load of all the processing, data storage, and everything else. There's no intermediate steps. And the quality of this stuff is pretty good, and the power is pretty good. Where you're going to run into limitations is in amounts of I/O, amounts of processing power, a cumulative latency, a cumulative CPU load, and hidden things that people don't talk about on these systems are latency, which really interrupt musicality. They don't really quite work as well as an original tape machine like a 2-inch Studer or Ampex machine. And, brain fart. The latency is something that really can bug me, as well as scalable I/O. Like, you really get stuck at a certain point with the size of that stuff. Let's go back to around 1998, 1999. And we have the introduction of the Pro Tools Mix Plus and Mix systems. This was the beginning of the TDM systems. I'm going to write that down. TDM. That stands for Time Division Multiplexing. That fancy word means you had plugins that would render in real time. You didn't have to do a file print style render to get reverb or EQ on something any longer. You didn't have to crunch numbers. The numbers could happen in real time. And skipping ahead, the real reason for that is that the MixCore card. These MixCore cards allowed for real-time processing of all the data. So you had very powerful chips, not by today's standards, but very powerful chips. And these in combination with the computer gave you lots of processing power, because your G4 was used to update the screen and shuffle data to the drives. All the processing, all the mix environment, all the digital information shuffling is done on this card. Meanwhile, instead of having one integrated box like the PC, you have multiple boxes that make up your system. We're going to forget about this guy for a moment. We're going to talk about this. This is the DigiDesign 882IO, and it's 8 ins and 8 outs. There are several different options for digital audio converting. And as you can see on the back of here, there's lots of inputs and outputs. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Let's talk about the overview of a Mix Plus system. You would have a basic G4, even a G3 will run a single MixCore card and speak to your DAC, your digital audio converter. That's what this guy is. That DAC is going to allow 8 channels of audio in, 8 channels of audio out. And you can do whatever you want with those 8 in and 8 out. We'll talk about that more in a later video. So you could bring in a keyboard into 2 channels, and you could put in, you know, your fancy smancy guitar, amps in. You could have your MPC 4000 coming in, and all at the same time with no perceivable latency. Meanwhile, you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different mixes going to your mixer. You could have a headphone mix, you could have a vocal mix, you could have several different mixes. Mix A, Mix B, running to different speakers and different headphones. One of the keys to this that's really different from where we are today is this was a professional system, and it was meant to replace Ampex and Studer and TIAC, very large format 2-inch 8, 16, 24 track machines. And this DAC has no preamps. All it is a line level input that turns audio signals into ones and zeros, moves them down your DigiLink cable to the MixCore card, and then from the MixCore card into the PCI bus of the G4. Hence separating the computing power needed for the DAC, the computing power needed for DSP and mix environment, and what was required to run the screen and allocate your data to the different drives. At this time, there was no middle ground in the marketplace. You could go with this full professional solution, or you had to step down to a 4 or 8 track TIAC kind of cassette. It was very rare to even run into a project studio that had like maybe a Fostex 16 or 8 track reel-to-reel on a half-inch tape. I don't know. I saw some of that gear back in the 90s, but it was rare to run into. You would run into cassette machines, or you would run into this. But these would be in the larger studios. They weren't even sold at your local Guitar Center or Sam Ash. at that time. You had to go to like Guitar Center Hollywood and maybe they had one or they could order it for you. And it wasn't before internet. You weren't going to call your sales rep at Sweetwater. So connecting this all up, you would take your mixed core card, and this is the card you want. Let's talk about that for a second. You don't want a D24 card or a DSP card. If you're building a real TDM system, this is where you want to start. You want to start at a mix core. So let's see if we can get that on camera. Oh boy, that's horrible lighting. Okay, if I don't get that, I'll post it up on Google Images or something. So this is a mix core card. I think that's called a DB60, and then it's got the little mix core logo on there. It has a sister ship called the Mix Farm. They're almost identical, and it says, oh, this one says core and the other one's a farm. Excuse me. Yeah, they're almost identical. So you start with a mix core card, you install it in your G4, you take your DigiLink cable, what looks exactly like this, with the DB60 connector on one side of it and a SCSI style connector on the other side of it, and you connect from that connector on your mix core and farm card to the back of your interface here. All the interfaces are going to have this SCSI style connector on the back of it, which just clicks right in. You have to tell the DigiDesign software that you are running whatever particular interface model you're running and on what card it is. And next thing you know, you're moving 8 channels from this in and out at the same time to this box. Where the power is in this is that it will drop into a full format studio. If you're running a crazy, insane, high dollar Neve 80 series console, this will feed 8 channels in and 8 channels out at the same time. If you had a really nice Eventide 3000, you can have 2 channels of this come out to your Eventide and then come right back in. You would eat up channels, I don't know, 4 and 5, and you would be using that Eventide in real time through this. So the power in this is low latency, professional quality, really modular, expandable setup, and everything is dedicated. And you're very rarely going to run into a limitation with this stuff once it's working well. You're not going to find distortions or transient problems. These were top tier items at the time. And they still hold up very, very well today. The system is meant to run at 48 or 44 thousand hertz at 16-bit, 20-bit, or 24-bit, and it will do mono, stereo, and 5.1 surround sound. Unlike our modern PC rig, where your one-size-fits-all interface happens to have a MIDI interface on the back, the items are discrete in 1990s, early 2000s Pro Tools land. You had full MIDI interfaces that would run your MIDI rig. This is a USB interface for Mac OS9. It is designed and co-designed with DigiDesign and Mark of the Unicorn to work with Pro Tools. Specifically, Pro Tools 5 Mix Plus era is when this came out. There are multiple interfaces you could choose by different companies. This is the one that I like. The USB driver provided by Mark of the Unicorn works great. It has some features that I like. It has 8 MIDI ports with status lights. You can see the communications from the computer here, and you can see the transmit and receive from each port here with a status light. And then there's a large amount of connectivity. So there's 7 MIDI in ports on the back, 7 MIDI output ports on the back, as well as 2 on the front, allowing you to just have access to the external MIDI to whatever device you have, but to have on your bench, but not permanently installed in your rack. What this device does for you is it allows MIDI notes to be transmitted out of your DAW and back from whatever MIDI device you have, whether it be a synthesizer, a drum machine, external sequencer, which I have some really cool things to show you what you can do with an external sequencer, and Pro Tools. Each one of those ports supports 16 MIDI channels. Normally you would have 1 device per channel, per port. This thing will support a whopping 128 devices or 128 different MIDI addresses. If you have a multi-timbral box, you might have a box that eats up 8 or even 16 of those MIDI channels out of one box or synthesizer or device. But in general, you get 128 potential items can be connected to this box, and you can stack these. So I run 4 of these in my rig all together at the same time, and I'm going to do more later, but let's just review. My build would be to have a nice Mix Plus TDM system. You'd want a G4 of any blend, because the load is carried by your mix core card. You can add more cards, we can discuss that later. And then 1 or 2 DACs, which are going to give you 8 channels or 16 channels a piece or combined. We'll discover that more and talk about it more later. And if you don't want to use your Digidesign Pro Tools system like a tape machine, you're going to want a MIDI interface if you're going to be making dance or EDM music, or want to use a MIDI rig or MIDI sync. You're going to want to use that I/O and have a MIDI interface. All right, leave some questions, leave some comments. This is my first video. I'm sure the lighting and the audio and picture was horrible, but we got to get our toe wet. We're starting. So OS9 Live Community, let's go.